Hello, friends. My name is Tiffany Babb, and this is the Interesting Jobs podcast, where I talk to people with interesting jobs about their day-to-day, popular misconceptions about their field, and what they wish more people understood about their jobs. Now, today, our special guest is Corinna Bechko, who works at the Natural History Museum. So, Corinna, what do you do?
I'm a fossil preparator. That's my main focus. I've also been working as an interim collections manager for invertebrate paleontology. So I work with the Dinosaur Institute cleaning fossils, and I work with the invertebrate paleontology group cataloging fossils.
Okay, so that's amazing. First things first, what do you mean when you're working on the fossils, you're physically working on them? What does that look like?
Yes, I usually go out into the field in the summers and help dig them up, usually in Utah, sometimes New Mexico or someplace else. And then it's a whole crew of people. We bring them back to the lab and we have specialized equipment that we use to clean them up. And sometimes they go on exhibit, sometimes they go into the research collections. But either way, they have to be strengthened, separated from the rocks, and just generally made so that people can use them.
When you say you're out in Utah, are these large plots of land or these little plots of land? What does it look like when you're there?
Be very barren, like your desert, like so hot. Often it's incredibly, not last year, the year before, the zipper on my tent melted. It was so hot.
Wow.
So it's very harsh conditions. It's very primitive camping. We go into town maybe once a week. We get to shower once a week. And we're out there just wherever the fossils happen to be. Usually it's on Bureau of Land Management land. It's funny because we call it BLM land, which to me, I always think it's Black Lives Matter land when people say it. So I have to be clear. There's two different ways that can be spelled. So it's land that belongs to everybody. So we're not bringing the fossils back just for our museum. They're fossils that belong to the people of the United States, and we are keeping them in trust for everybody.
That's amazing. What types of tools do you use in the field?
It depends on how. Sometimes things are like there's a place in New Mexico called Ghost Ranch that I've worked at where the fossils just come out of the ground and you're using maybe not brushes like you see in Jurassic Park where they're just brushing it a little bit and it's fine, but dental picks and things like that, little tiny things. But I've also worked in quarries where the ground is so hard you have to use a jackhammer. And I am a small person, and I really appreciate that there are large tools that small people can use. So even little women like me can do these things. But in general, I tend to work with a hammer and chisel or the dental picks and leave the jackhammering to the young interns that are very brawny.
So what types of fossils are you looking for?
Oh gosh, I spent about 5 years. We went to a place called Natalie Quarry, and that's spelled Gnat, Natalie, because there were so many gnats. And yeah, it was a lovely place. Part of the reason we went so deep in the summer is because the heat would kill off the gnats.
Wow.
But from there, the bones had a very distinctive green sheen to them. It's the only place in the world that I know of where dinosaurs are green. So we brought out a huge sauropod. It's the long neck and the long tail. And it actually has finally gone on display at the Natural History Museum here in Los Angeles. So we had, I think, oh gosh, I don't even know how many dinosaurs came out of that quarry. There were dozens at least. I've also been to a stegosaur quarry and one with a lot of Triassic creatures, which is very interesting, crocodilians and things like that.
That is incredible. So when you're in the field, when you're on a dig, what does your day-to-day look like?
It's very communal. It makes you really appreciate the crew you're with. If you have a crew that you don't get along with people, that would be torture. I've never had that happen, thankfully. But it's basically you have to get up and get dressed and get out of your tent as soon as the sun rises because it's so hot and there's no shade really. So you get up, you get going. Everybody communally has breakfast, makes coffee, loads up all of their personal gear because usually you're walking quite a ways to get to wherever. Like usually you don't camp right next to whatever exposed ridge that the dinosaurs are found on. So then you pack up all of your stuff that you'd need, your lunch, water, very important, and hike usually half a mile to wherever you're going. And then you're going to be up there probably all day. And so you go up, you try to work as fast as you can while it's still a tiny bit cool. Usually you have some shade tarps up. It doesn't do a huge amount of good. You look at the sky and go, I hope that cloud isn't going to rain, but oh, please come over here and block the sun. You work all day, and then sometimes if it's super hot, you take a rest in the afternoon when it's really hot. Everybody will just get behind a boulder or something and have some grapes or some Gatorade, replenish the electrolytes, and then go and work some more. But when you're out there, you go 6 days a week, and then seventh day you go and do laundry and take a shower and maybe go to Subway and have somebody else make you a sandwich.
That's fascinating. So let's say you've removed a fossil from the ground. What happens next?
It's funny because fossils are rocks, so they're very tough in a way because it is a rock, but the safest place for them is in the ground until they start getting eroded away and that sort of thing. So once we take them out, this is something that no human has seen before. It's something that has been there for millions and millions of years. And it's waited that long, so you might as well do a good job with it, is my personal philosophy. So we still do the same thing that they used to do back in when they were first finding fossils, and that's you put a plaster jacket on it. You bring it out. It's fragile once it's out because it's no longer protected by all of the dirt around it. You clean it off a little bit, enough to see where parts of it are, but you don't do that a ton because the field is very go. You only have a certain amount of time. You only have a certain amount of funding. So you get it out, you lay it someplace, you put plaster, mix up plaster, dip burlap strips in it, and wrap the fossil in toilet paper, or some people I've seen do it with newspaper, whatever you have a lot of and can bring and you can carry easily. Wrap it up, put the burlap over it. Some people separate that with a layer of tinfoil in between because then when you're cutting it open, you see the tinfoil before you cut into the fossil. And then let that dry, flip it over, do the other side. Sometimes that's harder than it sounds because not only do you have to hike in all of your water for drinking, you have to hike in enough water to make the plaster. So depending on where you are, that can be just you carry a big thing of water with you part of the way in a Jeep or something, or it can mean hiking all of that way with the water.
So how does the fossil get back to the museum?
Usually we have some things that belong to the museum, big trucks, like 4x4 type trucks. Usually we rent something, but the conditions out there are very harsh. So one place we went where we were going after a stegosaur, we popped 4 tires in 4 days.
Wow.
It's hard to get them in and out. Some places, depending on where you are, you can't just drive into them because the landscape in a desert it's harsh, but it's fragile. And we don't want to screw up the biosphere of today in pursuit of the biosphere of yesterday. So we're very careful to follow every single rule. And some of those rules are like, you can't have a wheel. So that doesn't just mean you can't have a truck. It means you can't have a trolley. You can't have a wheelbarrow. You can't have anything. So in that case, we have to rig up a sling, put the fossil in there. And again, it's a rock. So if it's a very large creature, say a titanosaur, where the one vertebra is almost as tall as me, well, that's hard. So you have to have several people on each side of the sling, and you take a couple steps. You switch places, you take a couple steps, and sometimes you have to do that for a couple of miles. And it's not easy, but it's worth it in the end. And then to get them all the way back to California, we usually just have a U-Haul or put them in our truck, and we trust nobody's going to steal something that heavy out of the bed of a truck.
That is wild. So if you see a U-Haul going by, there might be dinosaur bones in there.
Yeah, especially if you see a big plaster white shape sticking out of it. Yes.
What's the largest bone that you've found or that you've personally dealt with?
Oh gosh, so for the big sauropod that is now on display, I did work on digging up a section of the vertebrae. So it was probably, I guess, maybe 4 of the backbone, basically. And once we got that up, we had to actually get somebody out there with a forklift into the area. Luckily, it was an area where we could do that, to get the plaster caps, the plaster jacket onto the truck. And after we did that, I was like, oh gosh, Gonna go slow on the way home. So we get it back, and the lab that I work in is on the fourth floor. And it was so big it wouldn't fit in the lab, but we have a deck area. So we had to measure not only how big the doors were and how big the deck was, but how heavy this was, because there was a chance that the deck outside wouldn't support it, and then you would have your fossil falling into the ornithology collection beneath us.
Which is
Which
not ideal, I'm
they
sure.
would not have appreciated that. No, those are very fragile bird skins and things in them. We did get a structural engineer out, and they said yes. And it turned out that this fossil was a couple thousand pounds, 2,000 something pounds, I believe.
Wow,
But
that is
and that was before we cleaned it.
huge.
But he's so big. Luckily, we do have a freight elevator there. They used to do years and years ago. The marine mammal division was up there, so they had brought small whales up in the freight elevator to dissect back in the day. So we knew at least that part would work.
So once you get the fossil back, what happens then?
Once we have it in the lab, then we can do the detailed work. I personally really enjoy small detail work under the microscope, which I know we're talking about going from these huge things to little bitty things. But I've worked on some things that are like this creature called a thrinaxodon, which was right at the beginning of when mammals split off from reptiles. And it has actually little pits in its face where whiskers would have grown.
Wow.
Yeah, so to get at that, that was actually found in Antarctica. I did not go to Antarctica. I just got to work on the fossil. But for that, you really want the detail. And the detail was preserved. But what we use are these things called scribes. And they look almost like a pen, and they have a little needle at the end. And their compressed air blows through. So it blows air at the same time this little needle goes in and out. So it's almost like a tiny jackhammer. And there's some that are very, very small, and there's some that are very, about that large, not as large as a jackhammer. But depending on what you're trying to go through, usually I use for that with the little whisker pits, I use the tiniest one very carefully under a microscope and just grain by grain got rid of the surrounding matrix, as we call it.
That's fascinating. It sounds so scientific, but then at the end of the day, you're handling physical materials, right? They're not
Yes.
something that you can necessarily control. If this part is, I assume, a harder part of the bone and this part is softer, you have
That's
to be really adaptable.
right, exactly. It's a lot of people that do this work. Some of them come out of the sciences, but honestly, some of them come out of the arts. Like we have a couple of people. One of my colleagues used to be a director for like children's television and music videos, and another one used to be a sculptor. And all of them are very interested in the science, but they like doing that very tactile work with the actual physical things.
So on the other side, you're also working in cataloging. How is that different from this part of your job?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because with the Dinosaur Institute, you often have only one or two of something. So you'll have, we found a Stegosaurus, and there's one Stegosaurus, so there's several of the big plate on their backs, and there's a couple of limb bones. There's only going to be one skull, say. But with the invertebrate paleontology, you're looking more at the whole biosphere. If you're getting in a bucket of fossils, it's actually literally often mitigation. Like, for instance, if there was some stuff I just dealt with came out from under the Hall of Justice here in Los Angeles. They're digging a new parking garage at some point, and they found some fossils. So they delivered buckets of fill material that had stuff in it. And sometimes it's a brittle star, a sand dollar, a whole lot of shells. So what you're getting is you wash all of this, screen wash it through successively smaller and smaller screens. And then the curator, who knows all about the stuff, identifies everything. You make it into lots. So instead of one dinosaur bone, you have like a little box full of 10 shells that are the same type. And then we give each one a number. We put it online so it's digitally available to researchers all over. And if somebody has a question like, oh, the climate is changing so rapidly right now, what can we look at in the historical record to get an idea of where we're headed, or what warning signs we should see, or what will happen if the temperature drops 10 degrees? That would be a huge drop, but it has happened over time in the past. Or if it rises even 1 degree. And what we see are whole communities shifting and the knock-on effects from that. So we can see that, oh, something happened here. We have historical records in some cases of what to look for in the rocks to see if the chemistry of the water has changed or what has happened in different places. And we can track how oysters have. And sometimes it's things, it sounds very esoteric, but sometimes it's things that really matter to us today because some of these populations we can see that very valuable. These fish only do well when there's this much kelp, and that's a commercial fish that we need. And you can actually track then how these things have shifted over time. It's very interesting to me. It's a lot more data heavy. And basically when I'm doing that work, I'm just making sure that everything's filed correctly and put online, because if the data isn't correct, it doesn't do anybody any good.
And it's just like a historical archive, but like with.
Exactly.
So I imagine when you're getting buckets of material from a building site, some of the fossils might not be suitable for the collection. Do you keep everything? Or if there's stuff that you don't want to keep, how do you dispose of it? What happens to it?
That is a hard thing because collection space is always at a premium. I have my own personal library of books that I love, and I understand, like, I can't keep every book that I want to keep, but it's particularly difficult there because sometimes things that don't look amazing are very valuable to science. So in the public part of a museum is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the pretty stuff or the interesting stuff. And in the back, there's all this stuff that most people look at and go, it's a broken tooth, whatever. It doesn't. But scientifically, it's very important. So a lot of that is just down to having really good curators that know what's important. Like my boss will look at something and go, oh, that's a such and such shell. We don't have a record of that from Orange County before. And he'll get very excited. And to me, who I have a zoology degree, but I mostly come out of working with larger creatures that have backbones, I look at it and go, oh, it's a shell. So it's a funny thing, like even insurance purposes, it's difficult because the stuff is both not really worth anything. Like if you were to try to eBay it, no one would buy this. Yet it's priceless, depending on what it is. So you have to have really good people that understand not just the worth of the individual thing, but the scientific value of what it could mean for a larger story. We do sometimes not accept certain things because if things don't have context, they don't really do us any good. If somebody brings us a bucket and says, my grandmother had this in her garage, we don't know where it came from, someplace in Orange County. We say, I'm sorry, that's cool, but we can't house them.
You've mentioned local sites a few times. Does the Natural History Museum have a specific focus on Southern California, or is it kind of everywhere?
Yeah, we do actually. I mean, we do stuff all over the place and we cooperate with people worldwide, China, Brazil, but we really try to be, we say of four, and I can never remember what the other one is. Anyways, Los Angeles. We try to really highlight that. Of course, there weren't dinosaurs here, so our dinosaurs are all from different places because LA was mostly underwater. However, we do have whales and all sorts of things, and if something comes up here, like the tar pits is our sister museum, part of the same collection, and there were all kinds of ice age animals that come out of there. We really try to highlight that. But last year, I got the opportunity to do field work in San Pedro under a high school where they found a whale. So that was a very cool, we made that a real priority because we could involve the school kids too in looking at there were tons of shells. We found out that there were different horizons where the water had come up at different times. So the high schoolers could look at that and see exactly where the water had been and the coastline had been then.
That sounds like an incredible experience for the students.
I think so. If I had been a student at that school, I would have been over the moon at that. But
Yes, me too.
oh,
It sounds like a lot of fun.
yeah, it was amazing. And plus I got to crawl around under the school in a hard hat and use a flashlight to do my field work, which I'd never done before. It was an interesting experience.
It's very Indiana Jones.
Exactly. I felt like
that
that
earlier.
yes.
What's the single coolest thing you've ever done at work?
Oh my gosh. I love that little Thrinaxodon I was talking about when I found that it still had enough of the skull to show the whisker pits. I thought that was amazing. But time spent in the field, I've often felt very fortunate to be part of those experiences. One time I found and excavated a toe bone of, I think it was the Stegosaurus. Now I'm trying to remember. Sometimes stuff fades together when there's a lot of animals coming out of a quarry, but something about finding a single bone that you can imagine, like everybody has a toe bone, you know what it feels like if you stub your toe. And thinking of that as part of this individual that was walking the earth and going about its business and doing whatever it was doing and valuing its time on the planet, and then me being there millions and millions of years later. There's some connection there with the deep time that just, I don't know, I had just a moment of the awe that makes you happy to be alive.
Yeah, I think that, to me at least, going to the Natural History Museum, it's all about this wonder about the past. And there's so much connection, not only through localized space, but also just we live on one Earth. We have one history. And I think that's something that the museum does such a good job of relaying. Do you have a favorite fossil on display at the museum?
Oh gosh. No, it's hard because usually for me, whatever I'm working on is my favorite. I have done a lot of work on Triassic stuff, the first, when dinosaurs were just starting to get going. So I've done a lot of work with ichthyosaurs and those kind of creatures, like marine creatures. Those were the things that lived like dolphins but were reptilian. So probably my favorite might be the Thrinaxodon is not currently on display. I keep coming back to that because it's about the size of my like a cat. It looks like a cat dragon to me. And there's just something about it being so old, yet you can see in this particular example that it had died curled up in its burrow. And so
Wow.
it had its kind of tucked down. And other fossils of the same species have been found two adults curled together, and some of them have been found with babies curled, or at least smaller individuals. So they probably did some sort of parental care. And there's just something so evocative about seeing behavior fossilized that just gets me every time. It's been dead for just since the early Triassic, and somehow it still brings a little tear.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the hardest part of your job?
The hardest part, honestly, is that I've been temporary at the museum for going on 9 years now. And it's all based on if money comes in, if there's grants. I've been full time there, I've been part time, but I've never had a permanent position. So every 6 months or so, it's, oh, will I make it through this round? No, because there's just never enough funding. And I think that's true of a lot of nonprofit positions. And I wish it wasn't the way, and I wish we would fund museums instead of bombs, but that's the way it is.
I totally agree. And I think that's something that would surprise a lot of listeners because a lot of people think of the sciences as more steady work than at least the art side of the thing. Are there any other misconceptions that people commonly have about your work?
Oh gosh, I think one thing is that sometimes people think, like not everybody, but occasionally I do a lot of outreach. I really enjoy doing outreach. You can probably tell I'm very, I love the whole idea that these things exist and I get to work with them. And I think everybody should be excited about this. So sometimes I've had people thinking that because I work in the sciences that I would like to argue. I've had people come to outreach events and try to talk to me about like how like there shouldn't be fluoride in the water. And I think a misconception is that because you're in the sciences, you might be either boring or a dude. Some people still go, "Oh, you did that?" And or that you want to argue. And I never want to argue. I never somebody wants to talk to me about fluoride in the water. I'll be happy to tell them what I think of it and what I know about it. But if they're trying to get me to argue about it, I don't really have an interest in that. I feel like a lot of people in my position, we just want to talk about dinosaurs and cool stuff. And if you're not into that, okay, I wish you were. But
Is there anything else that you wish people understood more about your work?
oh gosh, another thing I think is just that these things don't come out of the ground totally pristine. They do take a lot of work to get out of the ground, and people like me behind the scenes in a lab, being careful not to breathe in all that dust. And it's not glamorous, but I think that the people that do it really love their jobs. And I do wish that more people did know that just how joyous working in the sciences can be. I feel like that's something that gets lost a lot just in, I don't know, the common conversations people have about the sciences in general. Like, I've talked to people at the museum who do all sorts of work that sounds like it wouldn't be interesting. I wasn't that interested in mineralogy before I started this job. But the people that have worked in that I've talked to are so passionate that now I think that's a really interesting subject matter, just because they're so interested in it and we're able to explain it in a way that made it interesting.
That's incredible. And also a really good, like really good proof about the importance of communication, science communications,
Absolutely.
and advocacy. So how did you get into your field?
I always wanted to work with extinct creatures. I do have a zoology degree. My earliest memory is being at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and being maybe 3 years old and sobbing because I wanted to stay and look at the dinosaurs more. And my parents' friends had a little girl who was about my age who was so bored. And she was insisting we leave. So we were both crying because she wanted to go and I wanted to stay. So I've always wanted to do this kind of work. I didn't think I could because I wasn't particularly good at math. And I was a woman. Nobody else in my family had gone to college. But eventually I thought about getting an anthropology degree because I thought, oh, that doesn't take a lot of math. Of course, it's still a science. And then I got into it a little bit. I was like, this is still science. And I dropped out, worked for a while, got enough money to go back to school. I was like, I guess I'm just going to try it. And it turns out, the math makes sense when you're applying it to something and you're not just trying to get through your high school degree for it. And then I worked for a while doing behavioral research studies at the LA Zoo, which was actually looking at the exhibits from the animals' point of view, because usually they look to see if humans like the exhibits, but we wanted to know if the animals were happy. So I worked for a while doing that. I've worked as a wildlife vet tech. I've worked as a zookeeper. But eventually I started volunteering at the museum, and turned out that I knew somebody who knew the volunteer coordinator, who introduced me to a volunteer position behind the scenes. And I guess they couldn't get rid of me because they eventually hired me.
Do you have any advice for anyone who's interested in doing what you want to do?
I think you can't go wrong volunteering if you have the resources. I know that is a very privileged position to come from because I was able to give one Saturday a week to doing that and then work my way through. And I know it's not always easy to do that, but another thing that you can't go wrong doing is going to a museum, seeing somebody like myself, stopping them and going, hey, I'm really interested in that. And sometimes they'll have something that they can tell you. Every summer, I have a couple of interns, and they come to us from Howard University and Chicago and different places, and the museum pays them for their work. So there's sometimes ways to get in that you might not know about. But if you have the resources to at least get to the museum and talk to somebody, you'll find that everybody loves what they do and will give you pointers. I mean, of course, if you want to be a curator, you would need to get a PhD. But there's a lot of jobs like mine where you just have to really love what you do.
So this is my last job related question, which is, what's your favorite part of your job?
That's hard because I really love a lot about my job. I think it's imagining the ancient ecosystems, because a lot of what I do is I'm working on a tiny little bone and I'm repairing it, putting it back together. Often they break in the ground, so you have to get all the dirt and everything off and then put it back together. And as I'm putting it back together, it becomes easier and easier to imagine that creature and what it looked like and what it might have been doing and what it was living with on the landscape. And I think that's what I really like. It gives me a chance to really, as David Lynch would say, maybe a chance to dream. You know? space to dream.
That's so beautiful. Where can people find you online and learn more about your work? I know you from comics,
Right.
and I know you're an amazing comics writer. So what are you working on now?
Currently, I just had the trade paperback of Blood Type come out from EC Comics. That's Oni's imprint. And that was the first long form EC story. So it came out of, I had done a little, they have all the anthologies of horror and sci-fi and stuff. So it had come out of one of the horror anthologies. And we just liked the protagonist, and she spun off into the story about a vampire on a tropical island. So that just came out, I think, last week. And coming up, I'm working on Sabrina, the Teenage Witch. The first issue will drop in October, and it's a reboot of the Archie. Well, Archie's getting a reboot on Archie as well, and this is its companion.
That's very exciting. I can't wait to read it. And that's it this week on Interesting Jobs, the podcast where we chat with people with interesting jobs. If you've enjoyed listening to our conversation today, please subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a wonderful review on Apple Podcasts. You can sign up for our newsletter at interestingjobspodcast.com. And if you have an interesting job or know someone with one, email us and let us know. We might even be able to chat.